G'day, mate. 40 here. Welcome to 40 University. Back to a favorite book of mine. Back with my friend Richard. We're talking about the Gerald Mundis book, Earn What You Deserve, How to Stop Underearning and Start Thriving. So how can someone figure out if they're an underearner? This is something that is self-diagnosed. There's no necessarily objective third-party test where a doctor's going to tell you that you're an underearner. But for me, I think the easiest way to figure out if you might have some sort of addiction operating in your life is looking at where your life might be unmanageable. So if you're consistently not earning enough money to meet your needs, then it seems to me that your life is likely unmanageable with regard to earning. And if you're consistently running up more debts that are in your best interests, then your life seems to be unmanageable with regard to debting. If you are consistently having chaotic and distracting and disruptive and degrading relationships, then your life is probably unmanageable with regard to relationships, and there's maybe some sort of process addiction with regard to relationships. So here's one little section of this book by Gerald Mundis that I love, Earn What You Deserve, How to Stop Underearning and Start Thriving. Pain is the messenger. It tells you that something is wrong. So that's one more concise way of saying what I was saying. Look for where your life is unmanageable. And if your life is unmanageable, you likely have some sort of addiction operating there. What do you think, Richard?
Well, some people like pain, so that doesn't always work for everybody, but sooner or later the pain will get amped up enough to where they might want to deal with it. But certainly in the AA Big Book, there are stories of people who nothing helped them. They just kept going. But yeah, I would say yes. For the average person, that idea that my life is becoming unmanageable in some way that's really uncomfortable, yeah. I would say that's a good way to recognize that something needs to be done. You know, if your foot's throbbing, you probably would go to the doctor. You know what I'm saying? Or if you had a pain in your side that just wouldn't go away, you probably would go to the doctor. But it's funny, when it comes to emotional pain, we have different levels of willingness to deal with that, because it depends on what you consider normal.
So what I'd heard about Underearners Anonymous and Debtors Anonymous and Financial Underearners Anonymous for years before I ever showed up. I first went to a 12-step program for issues related to sex and love addiction, but my computer broke down in May of 2015, 6 months after I bought this brand new computer, and so I had evenings free. And so I'd been talking about checking out Underearners Anonymous and Debtors Anonymous, but now I finally had a free evening, so I drove down to Highland Park and checked out a meeting, and I walked into the room, and it was a really nice place. It was a classy church in Highland Park, which is a nice neighborhood in Los Angeles, and I liked the feel of the people. And then it was a visions meeting, so very early on in the meeting, we all got to share 30 seconds on our vision, and that was incredibly exciting. So I started feeling energy flowing into me, and then as the meeting progressed and I heard the steps and the tools, I thought, I can do this. And so that was exciting. So the shared focus of attention with the room, I liked the room. I was able to relate to what people were sharing. I was getting a sense of energy. I was getting a sense of community and realizing, hey, every day pretty much I can go to a Debtors Anonymous meeting or an Underearners Anonymous meeting or a Financial Underearners Anonymous meeting, some sort of 12-step program dealing with finances. So I have found my tribe. I found a community, and there are people here that I like. There was one guy I met early on who was a stand-up comic who I'd met at a previous engagement that had nothing to do with 12 Steps. It was a Jewish engagement, and he was reading a political book that I liked. So he was a guy that I liked on many different levels. So I liked the people on many different levels. I saw I could make friends in the program. I saw that I'd feel comfortable with the community in the program. And I listened to the steps and the tools in the program, and I say, hey, this can work for me. So this gave me a sense of energy. And then with the energy, I immediately went out, and here's where my ego served me. I wanted to show people how I was implementing the program to turn around my life in my shares. And so I immediately went out looking for a better job. So my sense of enthusiasm for the program was infectious for other people. And then I was able to learn from their experience. Yeah, we were all crazy, but we were crazy in different ways. like it's not like there's just one way to under-earn. So that's a little bit about how I came to realize I had a problem with under-earning. How did you realize you had a problem with under-earning?
Okay, well, it's my first program was actually Debtors Anonymous, and I went to my first Debtors Anonymous meeting in October of 1999, and the catalyst for that was I was $70,000 in credit card debt. I'd been working with a business, and I was using my credit card to fund their business because I was supposedly a partner, but there was the lack of clarity about that. And it became clear that the debts were all mine, and that wasn't a workable situation. So my life was very unmanageable at that moment in time. And it's so funny. And I don't even know where this came from. It was just, some people call it a gunshot. Some people just, would say, hey, when the student is ready, the teacher, shows up. But I thought to myself, there must be a 12-step program for this problem. And I went to the phone book. And once you know it, I opened up, there it is, Debtors Anonymous. And so I called up and I got this lovely woman named Tina D. And she talked to me about the program, and I showed up at my first meeting, and it was the experience that I had was I was in a lot of pain. My wife was furious. My mom was upset because I used one of her credit cards too. I mean, it was really in the big book they talk about self-will running riot. Well, certainly I had done that. I wanted to have that business work at any cost, and quite literally. So, but I was operating in ways that were sabotaging what I was doing. And so it really came to a head like that. So I go to my first meeting, and I'm just really in pain. I'm uncomfortable. I'm feeling isolated. I'm feeling angry and scared, and just all those things. And I just started listening to people, and the things they were talking about made so much sense to me. It was like when I came in there, my whole mind was a swirl of darkness, and all of a sudden it was like little lights get shined on into that darkness, going, oh, that's what that is. Oh, that's what that is. All of a sudden I had a name for something that I never had a name for before, that it had been operating in me that I really didn't even know. But all of a sudden I got this framework for, oh, I can do this. And I got a great job like within a couple of weeks, and it was one of the best jobs I'd ever had. And that process continued for a while. And so that was my first exposure to 12-step. Underearners Anonymous, it would be nice if we just got well and that was the end of it. And I know a lot of people come into program thinking, oh yeah, well, I've worked the steps and I'm cured. And I've talked to lots of people and had lots of experience with others that go, well, that approach really doesn't seem to work. What seems to work is that what they describe in the big book, that this is a blueprint for living, and that you practice these principles in all your affairs. And really, for me, that's going to be true for the rest of my life. And the people that I know who are successful in program, and even people who are not necessarily in program but are successful in life, have a very similar attitude about that. It's like, this is how it works. This is what I know to be proven. Though I've tried other things, I'm just going to stick with that. I'm just going to keep going with that. I'm going to keep trusting that. But as far as meeting people that I related to, yeah, it was a real pleasure to just be around people that I could talk to about this stuff with, that would, first of all, would listen. That was one of the difficulties in church that I found, is that you could talk about this a little bit, but if you talked about it too much, people didn't want to hear it. They kind of tune you out and go, well, just just ask God to help you, or we'll pray over you and everything will be okay. One thing I know is that there are times in life where you cannot pray your way out of something you behaved your way into. You really have to change the way you behave. And my experience is that I needed help doing that. And even though, let's say, for example, in Debtors Anonymous, about 8 years into that, I got a credit card. I maxed it out again, so it's like, I fell off the wagon, and but learned from that, now what I say is, I never met a credit card I didn't max out. And I know we were talking the other day, you talked about something I recoil from. Well, that's definitely something I recoil from. And that's a healthy response. But in terms of Debtors Anonymous, in terms of Underearners Anonymous, rather, it got really clear. I got that statement that you get from the Social Security Administration about, what your Social Security benefits will be. And it lists how much you earned every year for your working years. And I looked at that and I added it up, and I swallowed hard and I went, oh my gosh, I'm an underearner. And so I started going to UA meetings after that.
So my first money-related 12-step program was Debtors Anonymous, and there are more Debtors Anonymous meetings than Underearners Anonymous. It's a much bigger fellowship. My first Underearners Anonymous meeting, I walked in to the room and met some guy who I would see repeatedly in the program or hear on the phone, who was incredible high achiever. And I mean, the things that this guy has accomplished, you would never think he was an underearner, but had a very interesting life story. The first speaker was amazing, a guy who graduated from like premier university and was doing very exciting things that have a lot of prestige. And then 10 years later, he was doing completely menial work. And often he'd run into people that he used to know when he was on top of the world. And like, he's thinking like, what the hell happened? And his girlfriend got him into Underearners Anonymous. So the first lead speaker was incredible. And then I remember there was this like really cute girl in the meeting, and she was wearing this really short skirt. And so I was thinking to myself, what am I going to learn of a spiritual nature from this cute girl in a short skirt? And she was like sitting in an elevated part of the room. She was like sitting on the stage. And I'm looking at this girl. I'm even seeing quite a lot of her legs. And when it came time for her to share, it was amazing share. She talked about the stench of underearning and how she can now pick up the whiff of underearning on people, and unless they're in recovery, she just runs from it. I've never forgotten her share, and I've completely written her off because she was cute and wearing a short skirt. And so I then discovered these amazing phone meetings in Underearners Anonymous, which was just a wonderful supplement to my life. And so I start getting on phone meetings. I start hitting a daily meeting, either Debtors Anonymous or Underearners Anonymous or some other 12-step program related to these issues. And it took me about 3 years to get a sponsor. I initially allowed my favorite 12-step phone meeting, Underearners Anonymous phone meeting, to sponsor me. And I'd just get on that meeting every day, and I'd write down things that I learned from that meeting and then implement them. And I think most people who enter 12-step recovery, we are not so thrilled about getting a sponsor because we have issues with authority. Like if we didn't have issues with authority, we wouldn't be underearners. And so eventually I heard someone talk who I respected. So I heard various people say they were open for sponsorship, but I didn't particularly respect them. But once I heard someone who I respected, then off I went. And eventually I got three different sponsors in the program. So I learned significantly from each one of them. What was it like for you getting a sponsor?
Now, I was in UA. Let me speak to that experience. I want to mention just one thing that's so fascinating. This is one of the things I liked about Gerald Mundis's book. And it's probably worth noting, this book was written in 1995, which was 4 years before I even got into Debtors Anonymous. Interesting point. But I like, he says, to under-earn is repeatedly to gain less income than you need, or then would be beneficial, usually for no apparent reason, and despite your desire to do otherwise. I do want to get to the question you asked. I'm not deflecting, but I think the definition is actually important, because one of the things that I noticed in meetings is that definition doesn't always get made very clear. And I think it's not clear to a lot of people in the fellowship. Now, I happen to think that that's one of the roles of a sponsor, is that with a sponsor, you get this, one-on-one relationship where they know you, they get to know your stuff, and they get to call you out on your stuff when you might not otherwise be willing, which I had happened to me many times. My journey to a sponsor in UA went something like this. The first couple of years, I had a couple of what we call action partners. That's someone you meet with on a determined and regular basis, and you talk about what's going on, and you promise to do certain actions, and then you'll follow through on those actions or not. And if you don't follow through, you say, "Hey, I didn't follow through, and I'm going to recommit to that and do that." It's like an accountability partnership. And I had a couple of those, and those were helpful. And I went to meetings, but I wasn't what is suggested actively seeking sponsorship. As a result of that, I had what I would consider a profound bottom in program. In other words, I hit a situation where my earning just went down and down and down. I sabotaged a major client due to the mechanics of how I thought about people and how I thought about earning and how I thought about myself. And it really got my attention. So at that point, I started going to they have a basic recovery meeting, or back to basics, they call it. And that's actually based on the Alcoholics Anonymous Back to Basics program, which was actually a program compiled by a guy named Wally P. And he's out of Arizona. And he was an historian for Alcoholics Anonymous. And he went back and he just kind of researched the history of AA. And what he found is they had these beginners meetings. And before you could actually go to an open AA meeting, you had to go through these beginners meetings. And in fact, you were assigned 2 guys who would take you to those meetings. And then once you attended those 4, basically they have 4 one-hour meetings that went through all the 12 steps. It was not really working the steps per se, although you did have an experience of that. But it was more like an orientation, like this is what the program is, kind of like this is the program, the whole program, and nothing but the program, so that there was no clarity around that. There was no mistaking what the program was. And so UA actually has a series that has those meetings. There was one that met once a week, and so I attended that, and I've had a group of people that a couple of women and another guy, and we worked together, and we kind of liked that. And this one guy said, "Hey, look, let's try something. I did this meeting format every day for 90 days, and my life changed dramatically." So we actually started to do that. And actually, there's a meeting, a basic recovery meeting that meets 4 days a week. They go through the steps, once a week, in that same basic back to basics or basic recovery format. And that meeting's still going on 6 years later. It's a great little meeting. But in the course of that, I wanted to form an action group with one of the people from that and somebody else. And I was just talking one and another, and I asked the guy, "Hey," he didn't want to be a part of the action group. And I said, "Well, what do you think? Would you be willing to sponsor me?" And it wasn't necessarily that I liked anything that he had. I just liked the fact that it was another guy. UA tends to be somewhat estrogen heavy, as they say. And so I asked him, and we kind of danced for about a month before he committed. and he wanted to get to know me. He wanted to see if I'd follow directions. He asked me to do some things, and I went ahead and I did them because I wanted to. I knew I needed to have someone sponsor me. I knew I needed to work through the steps really carefully and really thoroughly, which I had done in a variety of different ways, both in Al-Anon and in Debtors Anonymous. But I just knew I needed to do that in a fresh way and in a deeper way. And what's interesting is that, you know, this wasn't someone that I heard his shares and was attracted to, although I had actually heard him on meetings, and I come to think of it, I did usually like where he was coming from, but I didn't necessarily connect the two of them at first. But what's interesting is my issue with authority stems directly from my dad. And this guy, man, it's like having my dad sponsor me, you know, because he would say some of the kind of stuff my dad would say, like, you know, he'd just be kind of hard-nosed on stuff, but it was what I needed. And in particular, it was what I needed because so many of my under-earning issues, and for me, the kind of root of my under-earning is a fear of responsibility. That's really what it turns out that it is. And that was connected to this, you know, fear, discomfort, and lack of connection I had with my dad, who, you know, as in most young men's life, was a symbol for me of what responsibility looks like. And he made it look really unpleasant and really not fun at all. That was the way he played it out in his own life. So that was the example he had. So it wasn't particularly attractive to me to be responsible. So, so I found my sponsor. We took about 2.5 years to work through the steps, and I completed the steps, and now I sponsor people all the time. And I basically take a very similar approach to when I sponsor people. You know, I don't agree right away. I get to know somebody. I actually have them sign an agreement that says, you know, you're going to work all steps. When you get to the 4th step and things start to get kind of rough, you're not going to tap out. You're going to stay involved. After you're done, you're going to be willing to sponsor other people in the program. And you know, there's some other things there, but that's basically the gist of it.
I remember at one program, I was so desperate for a sponsor, I asked this woman psychic if she would sponsor me. And she said, well, let's pray on it for a week. And so I came back a week later and said, yeah, I'm eager to do the work. And she said, well, I don't think we're a good fit. So a psychic turned me down. I mean, can you believe a psychic turned me down? I even turned to a psychic for sponsorship in one program, and she turned me down. Wow. I mean,
well, sometimes rejection is protection, right?
Yes. I mean, another sponsor, I had to get up at 4 a.m. That was the only time that she had available. So for about 9 months, every week, I was getting up at 4 a.m. to talk to her, and we weren't exactly fond of each other, but we got through the steps. Let me read an excerpt here from this excellent book by Gerald Mundis, Earn What You Deserve, How to Stop Underearning and Start Thriving. It's the unofficial book of programs like Debtors Anonymous, Underearners Anonymous, and Financial Underearners Anonymous. So the first step in freeing yourself from underearning is to accept responsibility for the problem. This does not mean it is your fault. So I tell my sponsees, you don't have to beat yourself down for being an underearner. You didn't ask to be an underearner. And thank you, Josh Randall, for the $10 super chat. My name is Josh, and I am a fully recovered underearner. Congratulations, Josh. But I emphasize to my sponsee, you don't have to beat yourself down because you're a porn addict. You don't have to beat yourself down because you have an addiction, right? You didn't ask for this addiction. Now, it is your responsibility to get healthy so that you stop damaging yourself and other people, but you don't have to feel ashamed that you're an underearner. You did not choose to be an underearner. And this is not a condition that you wanted. It's not a condition that you deliberately brought upon yourself. And you may be completely justified in thinking that you were neglected or you're abused somehow as a child, that you were inculcated with all sorts of self-destructive habits. Essentially, any addiction means that your reward system in your brain is not working right. And recovery in any program essentially means that you're rewiring your brain so that your responses to stimuli are responses that serve you rather than hurt you. And so you learn to recoil from your acting out in addiction as you would from a hot stove. So if you're an alcoholic, the thought of taking a drink of alcohol you should recoil from that as though you're about to touch a hot stove. If you're an under earner, you should recoil from the prospect of taking a day off work to do something that's not going to bring you in any income. If you need the money, if you have debts, then that type of behavior is under earning, and just running the prospect through your mind should cause you to recoil. I remember in my 20s, I got terribly depressed because I'd run certain prospects through my mind, and I realized that I'd give everything away for sex, that there was nothing that I held higher than sex. The possibility of sex with a beautiful woman, and I would dissipate everything, give away everything, sacrifice everything, and it was just incredibly depressing to me. So now when I still run all sorts of scenarios through my head, but it's really a depressing experience, because when I run through these scenarios that would involve acting out in my addiction, these scenarios are repellent to me, as if I were touching a hot stove. Anything I just said you want to comment on, Richard?
Yeah, that I know we've talked about this other times before. It really, what we do is we rewire. I like to describe it that we're retraining our instincts, which the big book says, our instincts are good, they're God-given, they're a great thing, but they can get distorted, and most of the problems we have are because those instincts are operating in a way other than they were designed to help us or benefit us. They've been co-opted by some other, idea about what's important. And of course, you have to retrain that. That's not something you just wave a magic wand and it goes away. Now, we earlier we mentioned that this recoiling from under earning, and I love the clarity with which he defines this. He says, if you're earning less than you need, and that's a recurring pattern, that's under earning. It's very clear. It's not all the other things that surround that, although here's how he says it. There are many issues related to the problem of under earning, but they're not the problem itself. The beginning of wisdom, goes an old Chinese epigram, is to call things by their right name. To under earn is to gain less money than you need. Other issues which contribute to under earning or result from it are part of the syndrome of under earning. But that clarity is really important. For an alcoholic, it's like, yeah, I don't take that first drink. For me as a debtor, yeah, I don't use a credit card. Period. I recoil from that. It's just not something I do. It's not in my book, quite literally. And it's when you hang out in the rooms a lot, you see not everybody comes to that conclusion right away. It'd be nice if they did. It'd be nice for them if they did. But the truth is, I've seen plenty of people, and my wife's also in the beverage program. She's in AA. People come in and out. They come in, they're sober for 6 weeks or 6 months, and they go out again. Then they come back again. They go out again, because they really haven't got this clear recoil really established. And so, everyone's a little different. Everyone takes time to establish that. My wife was fortunate. She hasn't had a drink in 17 years. So she hasn't really gone through that. Of course, it's one day at a time, and we do have to do it one day at a time. I think it's a funny trap about things like that, is that one of the things that when you're stuck in a compulsion, it's like, I like doing this thing. Like if you're an alcoholic, you like drinking. Frankly, I like charging stuff in a car because I get what I want when I want it. I don't have to do the hard work of working for it or talk to other people about what I should do with this financial situation. I didn't want to deal with those. I didn't want to deal with those discomforts, or people just don't want to deal with whatever it is painful or uncomfortable. And then they go, okay, well, I want to stop this, but I'll stop tomorrow and I'll just do it today. And that can go on for 20 years. So it's really that clear, I'm not doing this one thing just for one day at a time. Just for today, I'm not going to do the same, because that's the trap. It's like, I really want to do this. I should stop, and should, is something, should is more of an obstacle. than it is a benefit. Should is usually an indication that we have a conflict. Well, I should do this, but I really want to do this. And so the should is what we rationalize, so we feel that we're good people, but we do what we want to do anyway. And so I think a lot of times when an addict continues in a pattern, even though they want to quit, they're shooting all over themselves. Well, I shouldn't be doing this. I should stop doing this. But so I think that clarity of what the threshold is so important. It's so important to have that threshold be really clear.
It helped me to picture my various addictions as a sword above my neck that could effectively cut off my head. I remember losing my temper when I was driving and realizing afterward that I could have easily, provoked a deadly situation. So underearning can kill you. It can make you live and work and travel in very unsafe parts of town. It can lead you into destructive relationships with people. It can alienate those around you, because no normal, sane person wants to hang out with an underearner. So this was one of the most painful parts of my recovery with regard to underearning. It was just recognizing the full extent of the damage left behind in my life, because a sane person is not going to want to be connected or hang out with an underearner. You would recoil from an underearner as if from a hot stove. And so seeing the extent of my dysfunction over the course of my life, and then all the opportunities that were then missed because no sane person is going to want to hang out with an underearner. Any thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, my sponsor actually said that to me. So, I was talking about a situation and said, yeah, they could smell your underearning. That's exactly what he said. And yeah, that's true. People, people always know what's going on with us. They sense it. They may not be able to articulate it. They may not, be able to call it by a name. They may not even be consciously aware of it, but they pick up on it. They always do. And that can be any number of things, not only underearning. I think that applies to everything. But since we're having a conversation about underearning, it definitely applies to underearning.
Here's an excerpt from this Gerald Mundis book, Earn What You Deserve. Underearners evade, avoid, and deflect money like running backs hurtling toward the goal line of poverty. Touchdown. Do not say no to money. Do not evade it. Do not avoid it. Do not deflect it. Let money into your life. Talking about money that meets the two criteria of money that is not debt and money that is not less than you need. Don't go out and work for $3 an hour. If it satisfies both of these criteria, then do not say no to it. And one of the ways that we frequently say no to money is by not following up. And another way that we say no to money is when we're given an opportunity that isn't exactly what we seek. So I remember various people have approached me to counsel them. I have no training in counseling, but so I just evaded. No, I can't counsel you. But then when we changed the terminology to coaching, it's like, oh yeah, I can coach you. I can coach you. I coach people in my Alexander Technique practice for $100 an hour. So if you want me to coach you in some area of life that you think I know something about, yeah, I'll coach you for the same fee that I teach Alexander Technique. So we often evade money by not following up. We evade money because the opportunities are not what exactly we expected. We don't think, oh, this is not in my very narrow frame. So I knew somebody who was not interested in any earning of money that was not Bible-based counseling. And there's not a huge market for Bible-based counseling. So people often think, oh, unless I'm making this money a particular way, then I'm not interested. Any thoughts, Richard?
I love that, because that's really indicative of what addicts do in general. They're unwilling to accept life on life's terms. In other words, whatever the idea they have in their head, that's what they operate from. But that idea that we have in our heads, that idea I had in my head, many years ago, I was delivering newspapers, just after I graduated college. And, I had this one customer around. It was a music editor. Okay. a very well-known music editing company. They're still around to even today. That was more than 40 years ago. And, you know, they liked me and I liked them. And the guy said, hey, why don't you come and work for us and I'll teach you how to be a music editor. Now, the underearner kicked in at that point. Somehow or my reality said, well, wait a minute, that would be betraying my employer. What? But that's what I thought. And I literally, I didn't discuss it. I didn't do anything. I just went, oh, that's not a good idea, and just moved on. I have to say, and you know, it does say in program, we neither regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it. But when I revisit that incident every once in a while, I go, yeah, that's really not something I want to do again. You know, I really want to stay open to when somebody suggests something to me, you know, rather than idea deflected, which is kind of a term we use, you know, as a symptom of underearning, that we deflect ideas that that are presented to us that might actually be very good. And most of the time, most of my experience with what's happened in life is the things that happen to me for me that are good usually don't show up the way I think they should, or the way I think they will, or in anything like that. It's that willingness to, you know, be relational, to listen to what people are saying, to talk it over with other people, and to kind of get a sense of, oh, what's really going on with this before I make any decisions about that. That's something that program has definitely taught me, because I know that that, you know, between my ears, that's a really dangerous neighborhood. If I hang out there, I will get mugged and robbed. That's what's going to happen. So, you know, and that deflecting of opportunities that present themselves because they don't fit the picture we've constructed of who we are, or the picture we've constructed of what life is, that's ultimately unhealthy. Although obviously neuroscience will tell us we do construct our view of reality from all the feedback we get. Nevertheless, we're also responsible for making sure that that's actually aligned to what's actually going on around us and what's actually beneficial to us in order for our own survival.
Now, someone could be an itinerant street preacher. They might be 33 years of age. They might be living with their family. They might just be devoting all their life to preaching on the street and developing, say, disciples. And they may simply bring in enough money to pay their basic needs. That does not inherently mean they're an under-earner. They're under-earning if their insides are in vast discrepancy from their outsides, if they're engaging in self-destructive behavior, if they're unnecessarily hurting other people, then these would be signs that you've got some sort of, you know, compulsion going on. But if you're living an upstanding life and you may be living at home and you may be devoting your life to street preaching or to painting or to all sorts of activities that have no prestige, but if you're generally a blessing to people who encounter you, if you are at ease with yourself, if you're not hiding things, if you're making a contribution to the world, you're not necessarily an under-earner. You could be a playwright earning $22,000 a year and living with your grandparents, and you're not necessarily an under-earner if you are leading, you know, an upright life where it's not a life that's filled with dirty, shameful secrets. Any thoughts, Richard?
Well, I want to bring, because we're you know, really looking at Gerald's book, I want to bring it back to the definition of under earning. And let's go back to this, you know, guy who's in some kind of, you know, ministry. He lives with his grandmother. You know, he earns $22,000 a year. However, he has food on the table. All his bills are paid. He has, you know, clothes to wear. And basically all of his material needs are met on a regular basis. And I'm going to repeat what Mundus's definition of under-earning is. To under-earn is repeatedly to gain less income than you need or than would be beneficial, usually for no apparent reason and despite your desire to do otherwise. Now, for no apparent reason, and a desire to do otherwise. Those are really big indicators right there. If you think about that, you want to do more, you try to do more. In fact, some under earners work really hard and they still don't earn enough.
Yeah.
Even if they're working 60 hours a week and they work 3 jobs and they still don't earn enough. That's under earning. And I love the way he describes it, that you can earn what you need in a humane way. I like that. I like that description of it. It's very helpful. But some of the things you were describing before don't really count as under earning in the strictest sense. And again, I think it's actually valuable to have that clarity, to have the clarity that under earning is not earning enough money to meet your needs. And I used to say at one point, under earning is just debting in slow motion, because sooner or later, if you under earn, you will get into debt sooner or later. And if you have the inclinations I did, you'll get a credit card and go, whoopee, I can take care of all this now. And that did not serve me, and it was not helpful to the people around me either.
So here's another passage from Gerald Mundus. Active underearning involves doing something that results in underearning, from quitting a job to setting low fees to turning down work. And thank you, Josh, for the $10 super chat. Big book, fear, mini step. We ask God to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be. This has been a superpower for me. Yes, there is a lot of energy and power that comes from aligning with God, with higher power. And I find it useful to use different names, to use different words, because if I hear the same thing over and over again, it tends to lose its meaning. So I've heard all my life about developing a relationship with God. I've heard it so often that it ceased to have meaning for me. So I like the different language of having a relationship with reality. And I believe in God. I believe in a personal God. I believe in a transcendent God who's described it in the Hebrew Bible. But I like different approaches to the divine. So it could be, I have friends who are atheists, and if they decide to define God as the best in themselves and in other people, like as long as it's higher than you, it can work. But let me get back just a little bit here from Gerald Mundus. Active underearning involves doing something that results in underearning, from quitting a job to setting low fees to turning down work. With my sponsees, the primary issue, as I understand it, is that they are simply not very interested in working. That they want to work on their book, they want to work on their, stand-up routine, they want to be thought leaders. They're not particularly interested in being of service to anyone else. They want to be famous, they want to be rich, but they're not particularly interested in being of service. They're just not particularly interested in being a worker among workers. Any thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, that's a big one. I'll relate to it first, just from my own experience, as someone in program. What I wanted from being famous or being rich was to right all of the relational wrongs that I had. In other words, I sort of had this conversation going on in my head whenever somebody would belittle me, or betray me, or abandon me, or do something that that took the relationship apart in a way that was uncomfortable or painful to me. I just sort of, without even really thinking, I said, one day when I'm rich and famous, you'll be sorry that you did that. You'll be sorry you treated me that way, and I'll run into you and you'll ask for help, and I'll go, nah, 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 or something along those lines. And at some point, and I saw this by seeing it in other people, but also recognized it in myself, a lot of times when people are pursuing something like that, like a vision that isn't necessarily healthy for them, or isn't necessarily producing what they want, it's because they're hiding from something that they're not willing to deal with. And this is a rationalization that allows them to feel good about themselves. Well, I'm doing this, so I'm really a good person. It's just if only the world would acknowledge that and start paying me for that. And if I keep at it, they will eventually. You can kind of go that track with it. But what I've noticed in program is that as I've as I work the steps, my willingness to become a worker among workers, or even to see myself as that, or even to see that, we're all pretty much in the same boat when it comes to being in the human condition. Some people earn more than others, but that really isn't the issue. And in fact, there was something he said about time. Let me grab that. And was with let's see, was a family said, first, begin by recognizing that your time, as the time of a human being, is neither more valuable nor less valuable than your partner's time. Your earning power per hour or day may be different, but the absolute value of that hour or day as a unit of time is not. Your time, as the time of a human being, is worth exactly the same as your partner. 1 hour equals 1 hour, regardless of who works it or how much he or she can command for it on the market. And I think that kind of gets down to that. Whereas if you, for example, think, well, if this guy makes more money than me, so he's better than me. And I don't want to ask for his time because his time's more valuable than mine. Well, that's not true. That's in essence what he's saying. So
I don't want to spend too much time on religion, but let's do 2 minutes. Judaism, Christianity have, I think, contrasting attitudes towards wealth. There's very little praise of the state of poverty in Judaism. There seems to be considerable praise for the state of poverty in Christianity. Of course, in the popular mind, Jews and Christians are thought to have somewhat different attitudes towards money. You highlighted a passage here from Gerald Mundus, which I'll read aloud. Many venerable spiritual traditions, at least in some of their teachings, suggest that eschewing money, possessions, and other things of this world can be beneficial and is perhaps even necessary to spiritual development. On the other hand, every tradition places great value on helping to eliminate poverty or the ravages of poverty from the world, which would hardly be the case if poverty were in itself ennobling or beneficial. So you want to take a couple of minutes to talk about Christianity's relationship to money?
Well, I'm not sure I'm an authority on that, but
you highlighted it, so I'm giving it to you. You highlighted it.
Well, what I highlighted was this idea that some people have that money is the root of all evil. I'm sure you've heard that statement
1 billion times.
Okay, that is actually misquoting what the Apostle Paul said. He didn't say that money is the root of all evil. Now, if that were true, if that was a Christian understanding that money is the root of all evil, then yeah, you should absolutely recoil from money, because if that's the root of all evil, then you don't want anything to do with it. And that would, you go look at a guy like St. Francis and say, well, yeah, of course, that's what we should all do. But the thing for St. Francis is, as Gerald Mundus points out, he had money. He came from a very wealthy family, and he said, I don't want to do this because I don't like the kind of life it has me lead. I just don't want to do that. And he's actually, that sort of parallels Buddha in that tradition as well. He was also from a very, very wealthy family and decided, well, I didn't want that. And that's very different. But what the Apostle Paul said, he said, now, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we carry nothing out. Having food and clothing with which we can be content, and that means just being grateful for, to me, that means be grateful for what you have. Okay. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful lusts which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. That's what he said. Now that's very different than that money is not inherently evil any more than a gun is inherently evil. A gun is dangerous when it's in the hands of a dangerous person. When it's in the hands of a law officer, it's a tool for bringing order. When it's in the hands of a soldier, it's a tool for defending. or in a homeowner when someone breaks into his house. But in the hands of a serial killer, well, yeah, it's going to be a very evil thing, but it has nothing to do with the gun itself. The gun is neutral. Money is precisely the same way. It's neutral, but it will reflect and does reflect who you are. I've said this many times to sponsees. Money is a magnifier. It makes you more of whatever it is you already are. And I think that's true. That insight really came out of working with a lot of. I spent a number of years as a contractor, and I had the opportunity to work with a lot of wealthy people. So I saw firsthand how people with lots of money, what they're like, how they dealt with money, and how they dealt with other people. And I saw some wealthy people. That one guy I worked with is a big commercial real estate owner, great guy. He was tough, but he always had your back. He paid you well, he treated you fairly, but he expected you to be accountable, and he was very straightforward about that. And but I saw him many times go out of his way to protect somebody who was getting themselves into trouble. Now that may be motivated by some self-interest, but he was the oldest of five family members, so I think he had the big brother syndrome, and he was trained to that at an early age. But I saw people like another fellow who made horror films. And this guy was just not a nice person at all. He had gobs and gobs of money, but he was just a horrible human being, and he wasn't very happy either.
Okay, let me move on.
Yeah, but just the way I'll just capstone that real quick. My conclusion is money makes it more of whatever it is you already are. Money isn't the problem. You're the problem.
Okay, here's another sentence from Gerald Munders. Much of your underearning is resulted from distorted attitudes and perceptions you have about money, about yourself, and about yourself in relationship to money. So when you have distorted attitudes and perceptions, life is going to let you know, because you're not going to be very successful and you're not going to be very happy. So you really want to have a relationship to reality, so that you respect reality and that you're not at war with reality. And when you're continually failing in one area of life, it's because there is something that's interfering with your relationship to reality. So, for example, it's very common in the workplace that people resent authority because the boss reminds them of their father, or it's common that people look for much more in the workplace than the workplace really should be giving you. Some people try to meet their social, sexual, romantic, and relationship needs in the workplace, and it's not necessarily the place to meet those needs. And in the pursuit of those needs in the workplace, they blow up their job and sometimes even blow up their career. So let me just reread the sentence from Gerald Mundus. Much of your underearning has resulted from distorted attitudes and perceptions you have about money, about yourself, and about yourself in relationship to money. Richard.
Absolutely. I'm kind of looking at this section where he talks about this painter, Charlotte, who worked part-time as a data processor, and she experienced agony each time she made an appointment for a prospective client to view her artwork. It would look as if she were begging for money, she felt. The client would be contemptuous of her work, think she was incompetent, reject her. She knew she would be humiliated and unable to paint for days. There would be no money. She would have to give up painting altogether and have a full-time job. All this went on in Charlotte's head. Yet her emotions in response to her thoughts were as searingly painful as if such events actually happened. So how we perceive what's going to happen, I love this quote from Mark Twain. He said it, and because he pins it. He says, "During my life, I have suffered many terrible things, a few of which actually happened." And so I think, so to me, from that, your relationship to reality is crucial. It's everything. And what certainly what program teaches me is that reality is not necessarily my idea of what things are. It's me having some ideas about things and then talking it over, reasoning it out with other people, and listening listening to, if you meditate, to do that. If you pray, listening to that, listening to what the God of your understanding, how that comes back to you in the context of that, not just going by what's going on in your head. Like this woman Charlotte, we just read that little section of, because that's what she's doing. She's living in her idea of what things are, and that's not reality. That's what causes all of these problems, is the disconnection from reality in the sense of how we're related to other people, how we're related to the world around us and what we think about it, how we're related to the people in our lives, even how we relate to ourselves, or how we relate to our idea of who God is. If you think God is a cosmic bully who's out to get you, you're not going to have a very happy life.
So Publishers Weekly, in their review of this book, said, in what looks like padding, Gerald Mundis presents an adaptation of the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't regard this section of the book where he recapitulates the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous but applies them to Underearning. I don't find it padding at all. I find it really useful to hear different language, different approaches, different examples to bring the 12 steps to life. So I loved his section adapting the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous to Underearning. I didn't find it padding at all. For me, it helped to bring the 12 steps alive. And this is a very good example of ways that people can take things that they hear in AA or some other 12-step program and then add to them. So there is a great deal of resentment among some 12-steppers about anyone who takes things that they learn from a 12-step program and then adds to it and then publishes it as a book or as a program. Russell Brand did this with his, I think he's got some sort of 12-step related book or program, and people go, oh, you're violating the traditions. And no, you're not violating the traditions. If you take the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and then you add to them, you give your commentary on them, you adapt them to something new, you bring something to the table, you are a content maker, not just a content taker, then by all means, go out, take the 12 steps and apply them to some new area of life, or apply them in a new way. And by all means, write a book on it, or start a website on it, or start a podcast on it, or whatever you want to do. This is something that is of benefit to the world. And when someone like learns something in Debtors Anonymous, and then goes out and they add to that and they get a book or they develop a course from that, they're not violating the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous or whichever 12-step program. Now, if you start charging money for sponsoring people, yeah, then you're violating the traditions. We don't charge money to sponsor people. But if you build upon the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and you bring something to the table, by all means, write a book on it and present it to the public. Any thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I saw that quote and I thought about that. I came to the same conclusion that you did, although by a slightly different route. I spent a lot of time in Debtors Anonymous in world service, like going to the conferences and being involved in that. And Gerald Mundis's name did come up a number of times. His books came up a number of times. And they were never accepted as literature for Debtors Anonymous. They were never voted in as literature. And I think there tended to be this understanding that, yeah, the tradition is, Alcoholics Anonymous or Debtors Anonymous or Underearners Anonymous, there are no dues or fees for membership. And, basically, we shall remain forever non-professional, but our service centers can employ special workers. Now that has to do with the fellowship specifically. That has to do with, like, Alcoholics Anonymous, they don't charge for sponsoring. They don't charge for doing any of the tools in the program that we depend on, like action meetings or, pressure relief meetings or goals pages meetings or going to meetings or anything like that. They're self-supporting through their own contributions, but there's no dues or fees. You're not required to do anything. And that was a decision to just trust higher powers leading by not bringing in things like money, property, and prestige. Now, looking at Gerald Mundis, he wanted to sell books, but he also used the material used what he learned from Debtors Anonymous and from Underearners Anonymous. And by the way, when Gerald Mundis passed away last year, there was a note, an obituary on the Underearners website thanking him for his contribution to the program. Because really, coming back and reading this book about underearning is very informative to anybody who's working the program of Underearners Anonymous. It really is. It's his experience mostly, and bringing the steps into it absolutely makes sense. It's not an adjunct. It's not tacking it on at the end just for some,
padding.
Well, padding is just for some, spurious reason, I'll just throw that in there because it sounds like a good thing to do because I think it should be there. No. It's really saying, hey, I've been talking about this all along. Here's the steps, and here's my commentary on the steps. And I think I got a lot out of it. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Yeah, to give some, go ahead, finish your thought.
And I also know that, it's unfortunate that he took everything he learned and put it in a book and didn't continue in the fellowships. I sort of think that's unfortunate, but I think that may be as much the fellowship as Gerald himself. I didn't know him personally, so I would refrain from commenting on any of that. I just know what I experienced in terms of the perspective about him among the people who were in leadership in both those organizations.
Yeah, I mean, there was probably an element of him feeling less and less comfortable in Debtors Anonymous. Also, a lot of people go into a fellowship and they get what they need, and they also give something back, and then they move on. There's this
Yep.
misconception that you need to be in meetings for the rest of your life. That's not necessarily true. There may be a fellowship where you need to be in regular meetings, but you may not need to be in meetings for the rest of your life in every fellowship you go to. There may be a fellowship you go to for 3 meetings. There may be a fellowship you go to for 3 months. There may be a fellowship you go to for a year. But you may very well then move on, and you may find ways to give back. So there are all sorts of people who've benefited from a 12-step program. They no longer attend that program or have anything directly to do with it. In fact, almost all the founders, all of the founders of Underearners Anonymous but one are not participating actively in the program. And that's fine. I mean, they did something beautiful for the rest of us. They helped get this thing going, and they got some benefit, I assume, from it. And then they moved on with their life. I know a lot of other programs, people come in for 6 months, a year, get what they need, and then they move on. And that's fine. So for a sense of history, I think Alcoholics Anonymous started something like 1937. Debtors Anonymous, Al-Anon started in the 1950s. Debtors Anonymous and Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous started around 1971, and Underearners Anonymous started in 2005. This book by Gerald Mundis, Earn What You Deserve, was published in 1994, and Financial Underearners Anonymous started something like 2012. So just a brief overview of the history there. Here, let me read a little bit more from this book. Did you want to add something, Richard?
No, that's really good to kind of put that, to have that timeline perspective is actually very helpful.
Okay, so there are all sorts of exercises in this book which I found useful, and one of them is to write about ways that you have actively or passively underearned. And what I found so helpful was connected with this. He said you may find it easier to write down ways that you notice people around you underearning. So I know for me, I find it a lot easier to spot these things in other people than in myself. So just writing down ways that I notice people around me, the ways that I know people I know underearn, just writing that down helped to clarify and to make more obvious ways that I have been underearning. So it's a great exercise. Write down all the ways that you see underearning going on in the people around you, and then you'll find it a lot easier to write down ways that you have actively or passively underearned over the past 12 months. Any thoughts?
You spot it, you got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, back to the, how long people stay in program. I just want to touch base on that. Just touch back to that for a moment. The gal I talked to, Tina D, when I first went into Debtors Anonymous, she's no longer in program. She basically, and for me, my program is it's a living thing. It has, I spend more time in meetings at other times. I spend more time sponsoring at other times. I balance between my life at church, that part of my spiritual life, and this part of it. I'm on a spiritual path. In other words, and this is part of the framework of that spiritual path. When the big book says we practice these principles in all of our affairs, and because the framework that it provides is a way that life works, whether we're in the fellowship, like you say, for 6 months or for 60 years, and there's everything in between, as I'm sure you know, it depends on the individual and what they're doing. So a lot of people stay in program because they like giving back to other people, and it's a great way and a great place to do that. And they just, that seems to be where their higher power seems to be leading them, and that's great. But if it leads somebody else somewhere else, so long as they are, retaining the value that they got and then passing that on to other people, which I think is the key to it. You really have to pass it on to other people in order to retain it. And I think that's really key.
Okay, let me read a few more exercises from the book. Yeah, write down all the ways other people are under-earning. Say they set low fees, they insist on getting things their own way, they employ unproductive people, and then add every other way that you can think of, claiming that emotional problems prevent one from working, arguing constantly with coworkers and supervisors, not honoring commitments. Then there's another list you can do, things you can do to change your emotions about money. List 7 things you can do to change your emotions about money. Let your imagination run free. You don't have to do any of these things. Just show yourself that there are ways that you can change. Some of these ways will be more desirable than others. Then write things I could do to change my beliefs about money. Write down 10 things you could do to change your attitudes about money or about your relationship to money. Write about 100 ways I could bring more money in. Write a description of your ideal relationship with money. Not what you think an ideal relationship ought to be, but what it would be for you. And this clarity can help you with your choices. If you've been under-earning for a length of time, a fair amount of what fills your life, such as clothes, kitchen equipment, furniture, will be worn out, flawed, and second rate. So start going through your belongings. Pick a drawer, a bureau, a closet, an entire room in your apartment, and evaluate every single article within that space, from an old tie to a TV set. Ask yourself, do I need this? Do I enjoy this? Do I take pleasure from it? Does it bring me joy? So some useful exercises in this book. Any thoughts on any of that, Richard?
There were quite a number of them. There was one where he talks about that kind of meditation about the, who I am, and going through that step by step. I looked at that and I went, that's really helpful, because we get so attached to the things that we think are important, and we use those to define who we are. And that doesn't appear, that in my experience, that really isn't very helpful. I haven't found that to be helpful. And there's this one meditation where he says, who am I? And you answer quickly, well, I am Richard. He says, well, no, I'm not Richard. That's just a name that people call me by. That's not the I who am asking this question. And he goes through this long meditation about that. And I found that particularly helpful, because the more that I'm attached to what I think I should be, or what I think I'm going to get, and I mean by attachment, not that I don't want those things, I do, but if I have this kind of relaxed attachment to those things, or relaxed relationship to them, that's not an attachment. I go, well, if that happens, that's good. If it doesn't, then maybe there's something better. I think that was a particularly useful tool that I saw in the book, and there was a number of others. I liked where he talks about emotions, and that, I say to a lot of my sponsors, emotions are like the weather; they come and go. you know, and we tend to, I know when I deal with people who are new in program, or even people who struggle in program, you know, their emotions run them. I'm thinking of this one guy that son of a very famous television personality. I won't tell you the name, but if I told you the name, you know exactly what I was talking about. And his emotions drove him. Everything was based on how he felt, you know, and because he thought those emotions were real. And one of the things he says, here, I'll read what he says. Allow yourself to experience the emotion purely, completely, without resistance. Be the emotion, be fear, be self-loathing, feel it completely, be with it, let it be within you. And just prior to that, he says, you know, most emotions, when you experience them purely like that, they last for about a minute or two, and then they're gone and on to something else. I think that's a fascinating insight. I know in the notes I sent you, I said, you know, I don't know if you remember that scene in Batman Begins where he's in the cave and all these bats are swirling around him, and he's just like, I'm letting it in. He's just letting the thing he dreads the most just swirl around him, and he's just taking a deep breath and letting it happen and letting it be. And he's just, that was such a vivid picture of what dealing with emotions can be like. You know, some people will say, I have emotions, but for a lot of people, their emotions have them. And I think one of the things, then I think what I like in there is he has several things that really are great tools to kind of detach from that in a very useful and productive way.
So I was surprised by how much work my sponsors gave me on step one. I came into the program thinking that step one, step two, step three is something we can just breeze through and make assent to. So step one, we admitted we were powerless over underearning, that our lives had become unmanageable. And then they gave me all these assignments. I had to come to terms with how underearning had crippled my life, how it damaged my relationships with family, with friends, with romantic relationships, how I'd consistently sabotaged myself and other people at work. Just the full extent of the wreckage that I'd left behind with my underearning was incredibly sobering. I want to read a little bit from Gerald Mundis here on step one. This is immediately offensive to nearly everyone. Powerless, nonsense, unmanageable, says who? And yeah, I was completely repelled by this idea of admitting powerlessness and admitting that my life had become unmanageable, because I grew up where I kept hearing that I could do anything that I set my mind to. And that was always my self-image, that if I simply set my mind to something, I can accomplish it. So Gerald writes, I was repelled by this step, first when it had the word alcohol in it, later when it contained the word debt, still later when it had the word underearning. Appears to fly in the face of most of what we've been taught. Where's self-reliance here? Where's strength? Where's willpower? Where's self-confidence? Where's pride? Where's near everything we so desperately need, that we've prided ourselves on, that we've been told we must have to survive, that many of us have worked so hard to achieve in ourselves? The first words in AA's book, 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, right after the first step is given, are, who cares to admit complete defeat? Practically no one. Every natural instinct cries out against the idea of personal powerlessness. So how, in the face of this, can we set aside our initial revulsion long enough to take another, less emotional look at the step, to see if it might mean something other than what we first think? There might be a way we can work with it. So the first word in this step, first of all, I didn't take step one seriously until I was more than a year into another program, because I was so repelled by step one, and I thought steps 2 and 3 were not very interesting. So you don't have to accept step one to go to a meeting. Like, you can get a lot just going to meetings without accepting step one. If you just keep plugging away, eventually I think you can come to peace with step one. So the first word in this step is we. So we means that you are not alone. It means that other people have the same pain, the same despair, that people have been here before you, that they are here with me now, and that you do not have to try to free yourself from this problem alone. And to admit to the problem requires nothing more than to acknowledge that it exists, and that you stop trying to deny or justify it. So powerlessness, this has a sickening, horrible ring, right? My reluctance to admit such a thing was caused by the fact that, were it true, it'd mean that I was weak, incapable, my situation hopeless, that I was condemned to go on under-earning forever, to live in poverty and deprivation. What else could being powerless over under-earning possibly mean? Any thoughts on step one, Richard?
I'm actually going to share something that he said, because it's step one is about just surrendering everything you've been doing because it doesn't work. And it's the admission of that. And so he says resistance to surrender, which stems from fear, is based largely on a misconception of what the word means. If you're like most people, you interpret surrender as meaning a loss of freedom, defeat, weakness. But one of its primary definitions is to give something up in favor of something else. The problem is the problem, I think, for a lot of people is just lack of imagination. They can't imagine anything other than what they've been doing, so they don't want to give it up because they think they'll die if they do, or something akin to that. But from a spiritual standpoint, in a lot of ways, the idea that you're in control is an illusion. We have no control. I have no control over what anybody does, or how anybody acts, or how anybody thinks, or how anybody feels. You know, and I certainly know, you know, very early on, you know, before recovery, I operated as if I did have control, as if I could make people do stuff, and that they ought to do it, and that they should be doing it, and if they weren't, there was something wrong with them, you know. And that notion is very distorted. But that's precisely the thing that has to be surrendered. The idea that we have some kind of power that we can exercise, and the power I have is to do something about my behavior, about my thinking, about how I respond to people. I do have something to do with that. And I think this whole notion is captured in the Serenity Prayer. And in other words, we think when we first hear that, we think I have to completely give up, you know, and I'm just going to fall apart and collapse into a puddle, and I'm just completely admitting defeat. And yet that's what they say they have to do. But the Serenity Prayer puts it in perspective. God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, which is just about everything, because we have to accept life on life's terms. The courage to change the things that I can, which implies that there are things that we actually can do. But here's the crux of the matter: the wisdom to know the difference. And that's, I believe, what program teaches us how to do. Is to know the difference on a very deep and intuitive level. You know, we find ourselves intuitively understanding how to handle things that used to baffle us. That's one of the ways that shows up.
So let's talk a little bit more about step one. Step one exercise I did that was useful to me is I took the 12 symptoms of under-earning and then looked back at my life through the prism of the 12 symptoms, and I was able to come out with about 8-page essay, and I saw how under-earning had pervaded my life. Also, I wrote about how under-earning had affected my romantic relationships, how it affected my relationships with my family, with my spiritual and religious community, and I looked at ways that I had continually sabotaged myself at work. For example, I like to say provocative things. I like to wind people up. I like to stir them up. I like to make jokes. I like to say things that are really tasteless and offensive. And that has gone all through my work career and not done me any favors. So I'm just curious, anything you can share from your own step one experience?
Well, you know, I've had in my lifetime a lot of step one experiences, and not all of them were in program. The one that comes to mind right now, I was part of a theater repertory company, and I was an actor. And I was in a scene study class, and I was doing this scene, and the teacher asked me, "Well, why are you doing that?" And I started explaining things, and then she kept pressing and pressing, and I came to this point where I just stopped dead, and I said, "I don't know." And she picked up on it immediately.